Alright, so for more entertainment here, I thought I would do a little video about the clock cycle that I use here because I keep yammering about the clock cycle, right? So I'm going to draw a little clock waveform, and we can say, oh, this is, generated by the Raspberry Pi, I said at one point. And I'll draw a couple cycles here, and I can talk about what happens. Okay, so there's the clock, and we'll call this one clock 2, and that comes out of the Raspberry Pi. Okay, now before it goes into flip-flops, okay, it goes through two inverters that I've drawn, in previous videos, and that would be clock 0, and that's going to be delayed by a little bit. So I'll draw clock 0. I'll draw it a little bit lighter here, and it's going to be delayed a little bit. Delayed a little bit here. Delayed a little bit here. Delayed a little bit here. And delayed a little bit here. So we'll call this one clock 0. Okay. So now, what happens is, let's say this is fetch 1. Well, let's say fetch 1 happened beforehand. So I'm going to draw this out. It wasn't planned very well. So let's say fetch 1. This was fetch 1 back in here. Fetch 1. Okay, because each cycle ends at the rising edge of a clock. And if it rising edge clock 2, clock 0, I guess it depends on if you're talking about what's happening in the Raspberry Pi or what's happening in the tubes. But we'll just generically draw it here and say, well, okay, it's somewhere in here. Right? And then maybe this is the execute cycle. This isn't an instruction that has any defers, it's just it has execute. So fetch 1, fetch 2, and execute 1. And maybe there's execute 2 and 3 on the end here, but we don't care about that. Okay, so fetch 1 is where the tubes send a memory address, the program counter, to the Raspberry Pi. So here the tubes are sending program counter to Raspberry Pi, and they send the M read signal saying, okay, Raspberry Pi, I want you to read memory. Okay, so the Raspberry Pi looks at that stuff just before it drives the clock high, because the Raspberry Pi is the one that's going to set this clock high. So it is very easily able to read the GPIO connector just before the clock goes high. Okay, so the Raspberry Pi is going to see this stuff. Okay, so Raspberry samples the GPIO connector, right? And that happens very quickly as far as the tubes are concerned. The Raspberry Pi is a couple orders of magnitude at least faster than the tubes. So anyway, it grabs the signals right before here, and then it drives the clock high and waits. Meanwhile, the tubes, are going to start clocking themselves into the fetch 2 state, okay, in here. But now here's the important part, okay? So the Raspberry Pi, so we're here in time now. And the Raspberry Pi looks back and says, oh, the tubes were requesting me to read some memory location. They don't care if it's the program counter or what memory location. All they care about is, oh, I got a memory address here, and I got an mread signal here telling me I want that the tubes want me to read memory. So what the Raspberry Pi does is comes along here and outputs the memory, outputs the data, output data, data to tubes, and drop clock. Okay, so it's outputting the data at this time to the tubes. In this case, since it's a fetch cycle, it is an opcode. Okay, so it's going to dump the opcode out on the data bus and it's going to go into the tubes. And if you remember, the instruction register is a latch. So it's going to go into the tubes and it's going to soak into the IR latch, right? All of this time here it has to soak into that IR latch, um, all the way up until it drives the clock high again. So this is half a cycle, and it has a long time to soak into the instruction register, and it also gets latched into the or clocked into the memory address register as well, because the instruction register just has the top 4 bits of the instruction, and the memory address register, the bottom bits get clocked into that so it can save the address that the instruction is going to address. So that has to get around and soaked into the D inputs of the memory address register before the clock goes up. Okay. Now, so it comes along the Raspberry Pi, does its little software timing loop thing to wait, 20 microseconds or whatever it is, and it gives it time to get around and soak into the IR latch and soak into the D inputs of the memory address register. Then the Raspberry Pi drives the clock high. Okay, but it's going to be a little while, a few microseconds here before it goes through a couple of inverters and then finally gets to the clock input of like the memory address register. So the Raspberry Pi keeps that data going, okay, all the way until time when it drops the clock the next time, and then it stops sending the data, and maybe it has to do some other thing. Maybe it has to write some data or something like that. Okay, but the thing is, it holds it here. So the tubes are going to clock it in somewhere in here. Okay, this is where the tubes will actually clock it in. Tubes clock it in. Clock it in here. So you want to have a nice long setup time, right, for those flip-flops. A nice long setup time. And you don't have to have a super long hold time, but this gives it a nice hold time so that you be sure that the two flip-flops actually clock the data in, into the memory address register and into the instruction register, and it gets clocked in, with a nice hold time here. So all this is like hold time. And all of this here would be setup time. Okay. And so this gives it lots of time here. So this is all your setup time from the time the Raspberry Pi dropped this here. Okay, it starts coming out right here. It doesn't, it's not going to go 2 gate delays before it starts coming out of the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is very quick, so it's going to get dumped out on that bus and go through those transistors pretty quick before it gets and get to the tubes pretty quick. Okay, and then the tubes have all this setup time, and then they also have all this hold time. Okay, it's going to get taken away as soon as this clock edge drops here from the Raspberry Pi, but this is the important part right in here, from the tubes. This is the tube clock, clock 0 from the tubes. Okay, this is the clock 2 from the Raspberry Pi. Right, but this is the important part. Okay, it's had all this setup time here, and it's had a good amount of hold time as well. So the main thing is, okay, that when the Raspberry Pi is sending something to the tubes, okay, it sends it at halfway through the clock cycle here, starting halfway through the clock cycle here, all the way through halfway through the clock cycle there. So these tubes have a nice stable setup time and a nice stable hold time. Okay. And the other important thing to know, when the Raspberry Pi wants to read what the tubes are sending it, it reads it just before the clock goes high. Okay, so it'll read just before the clock goes high each time here, before each of these clocks go up, before it drives the clock high. That's when the Raspberry Pi reads what the tubes are doing. Okay, and then it's sending things to the tubes starting on the downslope of this clock, and it stops sending it, or I guess you could say it keeps sending it all the way through until the downslope of the next one. Okay, so that's basically how the clock cycle works in this thing. Um, Main thing is the Raspberry Pi is driving this. Like I said, if Linux decides, oh, it's time to, like I said, wear level some flash memory, this just gets stretched out, right? Or this will get stretched out. And well, who cares? Okay, that would just give the tubes more setup time if this got stretched out. If this gets stretched out, who cares? The tubes get more hold time. If this gets stretched out here between the sample and before the Raspberry drives the clock, nothing's happening here anyway. It's just more setup time, okay? And so it doesn't matter if the, Linux decides it wants to, go do something and not run the Raspberry control program that drives the tubes. It doesn't really matter. It just stretches that cycle out a little bit. That's all. And if you put the oscilloscope on the clock thing, yeah, you'll occasionally see the clock glitch, and it stretches it out a little bit. But it doesn't affect anything. Okay. Now here's another thing. Okay. So like I said, the Raspberry Pi reads this at this point here just before it drives the clock high. So that gives the tubes all this time starting here. Okay, so like this is starting the fetch 2 cycle, okay, or maybe it's starting exec 1, where it's going to send the address. I want you to read memory because I'm going to, that's an increment and skip if 0 on some memory location. So this gives the Raspberry Pi all this time to come up with the address, or this gives the tubes all this time to come up with the address, almost a whole cycle to come up with the address before the Raspberry Pi is going to expect to see the address and command here on the bus. So like if this was an increment and skip if 0 instruction, right? So ISZ1, this should say read. It should have the mread memory read signal here, and it should have the address to read from. But the tubes have all this time. Okay, so the exec 1 flip-flop gets kerchunked, and then it gates the memory address register through the ALU to get to the Raspberry Pi. So it has all this whole cycle to do its thing, right? To get that computed. And then the Raspberry Pi samples this just before it drives the clock high. Okay, so that gives the tubes a nice long period, gives it the whole cycle to come up with the value that's going to the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so that's how that works. And here I showed you how the Raspberry Pi sends data from opcode. Okay, and then it has this cycle to get clocked into a register and all that sort of stuff. So there are 2 cycles of how to data goes from the Raspberry Pi to the tubes, and data going from the tubes to the Raspberry Pi. And there you go. That's how the clock cycling works. And Once again, I hope that was informative and entertaining.